Often we're very, very tempted, if you're anything like me, I'm very tempted to demarcate my world into different kind of spaces. As I said, over this series, we've been looking at the different spaces we inhabit. And often what we find is that there's one space over here that's maybe sacred space. Maybe we can call it church space. And then there's other spaces in our lives that might be maybe what we can call secular space. Places where we're not really sure how to bring our true selves in. And we start to kind of demarcate our worlds out like that. And if you're anything like me, you find that you become different people depending what space you're in. Did anybody actually agree with the question, or are you all so secure that you are utterly sure of who you are and nobody's going to change your mind? That's great. So I'm not preaching to the choir, so whatever, it's fine. We'll just keep going. If you're anything like me, you find yourself becoming different people depending on the space you're in. And usually that works really well. There's not much wrong with doing that. The problem is, if you're a Jesus follower and you've spent any time around church and Christianity, the problem starts to arise when you start to try to bring your Christian self into other spaces. Have you ever found this to be a tension and a challenge in your life? That you start to try to bring your church face into school space, or university space, or work space, places that actually can be very hostile to faith and religion. And you start to try to explore and express your faith in those kind of environments. And have you ever run into the case in which somebody that maybe you're a friend with or an acquaintance with says, "Oh, I had no idea you were one of those Christian types." And it's so defeating for a Jesus follower to hear those kind of things, isn't it? Because we find ourselves thinking, shouldn't people just know? Isn't there a halo? I can't see it, but I assume that other people, wicked heathens in the world, can see my halo as I'm walking around, and they wonder, what is it about that guy that's so different? And then I find out, actually, maybe they don't think I'm that different at all. Shouldn't it be self-evident? Shouldn't people just be able to tell from a mile away that I'm a Christian, a Jesus follower? Because we know that as long as our capacity to follow Jesus only extends to the life and behavior inside these walls, we know that somehow as long as our capacity to follow Jesus only really happens in church, then we're missing something. We know that we're probably missing the real horizon of what God is calling us to do to really step into the world and start to make change in other people's lives. And I think this is something like the perennial question for Jesus followers. It's the question we constantly circle back to and have been doing so for 2,000 years. The question is, how do we witness to Jesus in those kind of spaces? Because it's very, very easy to witness to Jesus in church. Very, very easy. When somebody in church asks you how your week's been, you just tell them about your blessing reports. That's what we call them. Oh, I had a great week. God did this for me. God did that for me. And then I wasn't sure about the other thing, but I prayed and God did that too. But the problem is when you get out of this space, into spaces where people don't understand that kind of language, then how do you witness to Jesus there? Well, let's ask the question this way, in line with the conversation we've been having the last few weeks. How do our lives start to overlap and start to intersect with those who don't know Jesus? How do we start to bring our Christian selves into spaces that are very difficult to bring that into? In the 1960s, there was a Dutch traffic engineer named Hans Monderman. Just go with me on this. And Hans Monderman decided that he wanted to end all traffic fatalities. He said, actually, there is a way to stop road accidents ever happening again. See, what Monderman noticed was that all road design was built around the same principle. Anywhere you go in the world, and the principle is this: there are two different kind of spaces. One is space for cars and vehicles, and one is space for pedestrians and people. And bicycles just do whatever they want. If the light's red, they just pretend they're a pedestrian, and you follow the white man across the road, and that's fine too. And Monderman said, actually, the problem with that principle is that everything you do in road design is designed to keep those two spaces separate, to demarcate between space for cars and space for pedestrians and make sure that those two things never overlap. Because most people think accidents happen when those two spaces overlap without anyone realizing. And so road design puts signs up and lights and curbs and crosswalks. It demarcates the space between those two kind of worlds, and it makes that demarcation greater. And Monderman came up with a different solution. He said this: the problem is that those road signs are saying to cars, this is your space, and we've organized your behavior so that as long as you behave this way, nothing can happen to you. But that is the wrong story. You see, what Monderman said was that as long as there are signs and street lights and a sign telling you how fast you can go and one telling you when to stop if pedestrians are crossing, you'll never really check if people are in the road. You'll never really look around you and actually bother doing the hard work of wondering if you're about to hit somebody because you just trust that the signs are doing the job for you. By the way, that you might not understand this because this happens everywhere but Calgary, whereas if a pedestrian steps into the road, everyone comes to a stop immediately. I don't know, it's like pedestrians are king here. Do you guys understand that? Is that a thing? Maybe just coming from Britain, that's a thing because we don't care about pedestrians at all. So Mondaman looked around and he said, the problem is that all those signs and lights and curbs and crosswalks are demarcating two different spaces, so you never expect them to overlap. Now, Mondaman's solution was this, and it sounds radical. He said, let's get rid of all of it. Let's get rid of signs. Let's get rid of lights. There'll be no more traffic lights. Let's even get rid of crosswalks. He even said, let's get rid of curbs. So pedestrians have to walk in the exact same space that cars drive. And he called this radical notion shared space. He said, instead of having two different kinds of spaces, let's bring them together and call it shared space. And what was the result? The result was that accidents went down exponentially. Actually, it went as far as this. On Mondaman's roads, it's claimed that there has never been a fatal accident, ever. You see, this is important for us because you and I have this tendency to demarcate our worlds into two different spaces. On the one hand, there's sacred space, church space. And on the other hand, there's, let's call it profane space, secular space, non-churchy Christian space. And as long as the church has been around, it's been making this strange distinction between the two. That over here is the sacred and over here is the secular, and never must the two meet. And so what we do is we say, okay, there's my church self over here, but then I need a different person for when I'm at home. And I need a different person entirely for when I'm at school and when I'm at work and when I'm at church again. When I go back there on a Sunday, I need to make sure that I put my church face on. And this is why I ask this question. Do you ever find yourself becoming a different person, however slightly and subtly, depending on the kind of people that you're around? And my hunch is that most of us have had some experience of doing that. Because we recognize that there's behaviors and there's beliefs and there's ways of being that demarcate church space and all the other space. And we make sure that those two worlds never overlap, that they never share space. Have you ever bumped into someone in a context in which you've never seen them in before? And it's just bizarre. You're just like, I know you from this space, and then seeing you over here, I don't really know how to engage with you. Well, if you have, probably the most awkward way that that can ever happen is if you've had someone who maybe doesn't know that you're a Christian, and maybe you spend time with them at school or at work, and then one day they wander into Westside King's Church, and you're like, oh, holy crap, what do I do now? Now they know that I'm a Christian, and I don't know how to respond in this kind of an environment. We have different ways of being in different spaces. When I was growing up, my parents became Christians when I was very young, and I always knew when we were going to church. Doesn't just matter if it's a Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night. We would have programs throughout the week, and I'd always know from a very early age if we were about to go to church. You know why? Because my mum had a church perfume. She had the same perfume that she only wore for church. And so as young as about 5 or 6, I would start getting ready for church just because of the smell in the house. Like, okay, we must be going to church. She had a different perfume for going out. She had a different perfume for hanging out with her friends. She had one perfume for church. And it taught me, even as a child, that there's a way of demarcating this space from all the other space. There's one kind of person that I am when I'm at church, and there's a different kind of person that I try to be in other spaces. And this works the reverse way as well, that if you go to a party and it's with wicked heathens who don't go to church, then you're told as a Christian, particularly as a young Christian, that if you're going to that party, you better be going to evangelize them. You better be going to tell them about Christ. So when you walk in, you say, no, I don't want a Jell-O shot, and here's why. That works really, really well. You can't party just because you want to party. That's not allowed as a Christian. And equally, if those heathens darken the door of our church, then they have to understand how they behave, what it means to be here. When I was at church at university, we had a guy who came in. He'd clearly never been in church before. The preacher got to a point in his sermon that the guy, I guess, didn't like. And he stood up in the middle of the church and said, I don't agree with that. And everybody went silent. Because you're not allowed to disagree with the guy at the front. And if you are, you're not allowed to say it. But he didn't know how to behave. He didn't know what it meant to bring these two spaces together. And all of that reinforces this distinction between church and world. This distinction between sacred space and secular space, between the holy on one hand and the profane on the other. And all of it makes sure that those two worlds never overlap. But there's a problem with that. The problem is this, and maybe you've picked up on it already. The problem is that the Christian story has no space and no place for a God who draws lines between the sacred and the secular. The Christian story is about a God who steps into the secular so that his holiness and his goodness and his sacredness can intersect with the unholy and the broken and the profanity of the world. The Christian story starts with a God in Jesus who sabotages the secular by bringing the sacred into it and letting the two clash and collide and seeing what happens. And this is important for us at 1830 because this is true of church as well. Church at its best has never been about demarcating two worlds. It's been about what happens when those two spaces collide. When we start to rub out and blur the lines between the two. And when we let the world spill into the church and disrupt it a little bit and challenge us a little bit and have people here who aren't like us and don't look like us and behave like us, but equally when we let the church spill out into the world and transform it. That is church done at its very best. And so the question for us at 1830 as we wrestle through the kind of community that we want to be is how do you create a place where those two spaces can actually intersect? How do you witness to Jesus, not only in a way that disrupts the comfort and convenience of sacred space, but also in the opposite way? How do you create space that spills out and transforms the world beyond these walls? And the clue and what we're going to jump into tonight with the time we have left is actually found right there in the early church. Right in the New Testament, at the beginning of this vision of this thing called church community, we find a guy called Paul. And Paul is the master of understanding what happens when the gospel collides with the world beyond the church. In Acts 17 it says this, while Paul was in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue, hold on to that word, with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day, with those who happened to be there. So there's two words there that I've put in bold to make it very, very obvious where I'm going with this. Because these are two different spaces. The two spaces that you and I are very deeply aware of, even if we're not sure that we are aware of it. The first is the synagogue. This place where the Jews hang out. It's sacred space. In the middle of a city like Athens that is anything but Jerusalem. It isn't sacred space. It's a deeply pagan place. There's this little bastion of gospel. This little bastion of religious sacred community. It's called the synagogue. And that's where Paul goes first. But then where does he go after that? He goes into the marketplace. This secular space. The place where people actually don't know God. You see, the wisdom of Paul is that he knows the space that he's in, and he knows how to lead people to Jesus in either of those spaces. And so tonight I want us to deconstruct this a little bit. Let's start here in this first space. Acts 17 goes on. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. So what's the first thing that Paul does in this pagan city? He goes to the synagogue. This isn't Jerusalem. This is a place that's deeply hostile to belief, that's hostile to faith. In fact, Christians in the first century, do you know what they were called? They were called atheists. Because they were the only kind of people who had any different understanding of what faith is than the Greeks. And the only thing that the Greeks could make of that was to say, you're so radically different, we're going to call you atheists. People who don't even believe in God because your ideas are so far removed from ours. So Paul finds himself in a place that is hostile to belief. Have you ever been in a place like that? Have you ever been in a place where you're not really sure how to practice your faith openly? And it doesn't mean that you've been under great persecution. It just means that it's very, very difficult to know, how do I bring my church Christian self into this space? Well, if you have, what do you do when you're there? What do you do when you go to university and you realize, maybe for the first time in your life, that you're not surrounded by Christians anymore? Well, if you're a normal, functional human being, then you start to move away from that space and you go back to the place where people are like you. You gravitate and orbit around the people who are like you. The people who believe like you and behave like you and look like you. The people who understand where you're coming from. And this is exactly what Paul does. He goes first to the synagogue. Now remember that Paul's a Jew. Christianity was fundamentally a Jewish sect, and so Paul does the only thing that he knows how to do as a good Jew in a place that's hostile to faith. He goes to the place where all the other Jews are. He goes where he's most comfortable, to his people, his turf, his crowd. See, all of us have a place that we are most ourselves. You remember the first week, if you were with us as we jumped into this series, we asked, where do you most feel a sense of belonging? Where do you most feel that space in which you can be your unfiltered, authentic self? And I want to call these first spaces. And maybe for you, this is actually Christian community. This space in which you can journey with people who believe like you believe. Now, hear me right, it's important to have those spaces. It's fundamentally important to have a first space in your life where you can be fully yourself. Because without that kind of space, it's disorienting. I spent 3 months at one point in the Congo where not a person speaks English. And it was the most difficult time of my life because everywhere I looked, at church, at home, at work, nobody spoke my language. I couldn't connect with anybody. That's what it's like to be in a space in which you don't have a first space, a place where you can go with people who are like you. And I want to say tonight, if you're a Jesus follower, don't try to do life by yourself. This space here at 1830, this space at Westside Kings or church in general is designed to be a place that strengthens your faith journey. That's what it's for. And if you're not a Jesus follower, then it's equally true that you shouldn't do life by yourself. The 1830 is actually designed to be a place where you can find belonging. Maybe you don't know where to find community or home or connection. Whether you're sure where you're at with your faith or not, this is a space that you can belong. So Paul goes into this first space, but interestingly, he doesn't stay in this first space. He goes to church like every good Jew, but he doesn't stay in church. Where does he go next? A group of philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. So he goes first to this first space. That's where he starts, but then ultimately he moves out of that space into another place, a place where nobody believes like him, where nobody looks like Paul, where nobody behaves or thinks like Paul. He starts in the synagogue with the religious leaders, but ultimately he moves out and spends time with the philosophers, people who make a career out of asking questions. So let's call this third space, space outside of the sacred. And maybe it's for you school, maybe it's work, maybe for you it's even family life, and that is a place where you don't really know how you can truly be yourself. You see, first space is great, and it's cozy, and it's comfortable. It's nice to be at home. It's nice to be at home where you can put your slippers on, not have to put your makeup on or do your hair, and just be yourself. First space is incredibly important, but we spend most of our time in third space, don't we? We spend most of our time in that place where people are fundamentally different from us. And so Paul starts in the synagogue because it's a good place to start, but he doesn't end in the synagogue. He recognizes that as a Jesus follower, you have to go out. You have to go out into spaces where it's uncomfortable and hostile, where it's difficult, where people aren't like you. Why? Jeremy's going to tell us, because the guy on the phone has the answer to that question. You have to do that because that's where the world needs to intersect with the grace of Jesus. But often church has a different strategy. Often we say, we don't have to go out into their space, we just have to get them to come into our space. Early church evangelism was built on the principle of go. Go out into the world and make disciples. And 21st century evangelism is often built on the principle of come. Come to us. This is a good space. Get out of your world, the secular world, and come into the sacred world. Because if God is only present in the first space, in our Bible studies and worship and Sunday mornings and Christian potluck dinners, then it follows that you have to get people out of their space and into ours. But it's problematic because our first space is somebody else's third space. That actually it doesn't work to drag people out of their world and into ours. Instead, we have to go into their world, where we're the odd one out, where it's difficult for us to be because that is where they need to intersect with the grace of God. Which leads us right back to this question. How do those two spaces actually intersect? How do we move people from third space into this space? People from the margins of community into the center of connection. And how, as Jesus followers, do we actually intersect constructively? How do we actually engage with people outside of church in a way that is transformational? Not in our space, but in their space. Well, I want to point out two things here. The first is this. It says, when Paul goes into that third space, into secular world, what does it say? It says they followed Paul. Actually, it says that maybe people are going to follow Paul or follow you even before they're sure if they believe the same things you believe. That actually they're going to catch on to the life that you live and say, there's something about this person coming into my space that makes me intrigued about what might be in their space. People who don't trust Jesus yet might just trust you and follow you into your space. Why? Because you first shared their space. Every Thursday morning I spend time at the Calgary Dream Center leading in Bible studies with guys over there. And it's fascinating to see how often they want to come into this church, how often they want to transition from Dream Center, a place where they feel at home and comfortable, their first space, into my first space, a place that can be difficult for people like that. Why? Because I've first been with them in their space. You see, often what we do is we hope that people will go from first space into third space, that they will just find an easy transition point in which they can make that connection. And actually what we need to do first is start in their space, to start here. And to say, if I can inhabit your space, then maybe it becomes easier for you to start to come back to mine. Maybe because I've been with you where you're comfortable, it becomes easier for you to start to come and join me where I'm comfortable. And so that's what it says of the third space. But ultimately then Paul is in the synagogue. And what does it say? It doesn't say the people in the synagogue followed Paul. That's a very different language. It says the people in the synagogue joined Paul. You see, there's a different way that Christians respond to a radical Christian life that's different from people who don't know Jesus. People who don't know Jesus are intrigued. And they say, maybe I can be invested in this. Maybe I can participate. Maybe I can hear more. People who know Jesus have a different response. They join. They say, actually, maybe this is a movement that I can actually join. Maybe this is a movement of momentum that I can actually jump into and participate in. Often we think that Jesus is busy trying to save non-Christians, and that's true. But often we think that at the expense of realizing Jesus wants to save Christians as well. Jesus wants to save Christians from apathy. He wants to save Christians from complacence. He wants to save Christians from getting into a bubble in the first space and never knowing how to jump out of that into the third space. And so listen, as we close off tonight, the reason I think this is an important conversation for us is because this is where we want to go as 1830. This actually starts to shape and contribute to the model that we want to push as a community here at 1830. Maybe for us, this first space is what we can call something like home groups and small groups. A place where you can start to journey with people who share your faith. People who want to be vulnerable with one another. People who want to dig deep into authentic connection and grow together. And then maybe the third space is actually a way that we can start to embed ourselves in lives and communities outside of this one. Maybe it's like me being at Dream Center on a Thursday morning. Or maybe it's us going into climbing clubs and spending time together, getting into people's lives and stories. Actually embedding ourselves in people's first space, which for us is difficult. For us, where it isn't comfortable and convenient to have a faith, where actually it might even be hostile to faith, and we start to embed ourselves in those communities. Why? Because then we can start to help people transition in to this community. And then that leaves us with the same question that we started with. How do you actually bring those two worlds together? How do you actually start to move people from third space into first space? And how do you start to move people from first space, from the Christian bubble, into third space? Well, I think we need something in the middle. We need a middle space. And that is ultimately what Sunday nights exist for at Westside. That Sunday nights here at 1830 exist as a shared space. A place where we can start to blur the lines between what is sacred and what is secular. Where we can start to say, actually, if you don't know where you're at on this faith journey, this is a great place for you to start. Because we're starting to move people from their third space into our first space. A place where you can ask questions you're not supposed to ask in church. A place where you have permission to doubt and to explore and to challenge the big pieces of faith. A place where you're able to move from the margins of community into the center of community. Where you're able to start to say, because you met me in my space, I want to join you in yours. And I'm not ready to jump into deep, rich, authentic relationship and community. Like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, not everybody's ready to just jump in at the deep end and say, I want to share my life with you people. But they do want to ask questions. They do want to start to explore. They do want to find an avenue that helps them move from the margins to the center of community. And that's what Sunday nights exist for at 1830. If you're new here or you've been here for a while, the solution to this is the same. That actually the way you can start to engage is to join us on a Sunday night. To start to be in a space in which you have permission to ask questions that are very difficult to ask in church. Questions you can't ask in first space. Questions that you can ask with permission to doubt and engage and explore. Questions that help you move from third space into first space. As a close, I want this to kind of be our benediction for this next year and certainly for closing off this conversation over the last few weeks. Vincent Donovan says this: in working with young people in America, don't try to call them back to where they were. Don't try to just leave them in their third space. And don't try to call them to where you are, as beautiful as that place might seem to you. Don't just try to fast track them into intimacy. You must have the courage to go with them to a place that neither you nor they have ever been before. That actually, maybe at 1830, this can be a space where we have all three spaces, where we actually allow people to dwell in their world and go with them into their community, to actually find them right where they are, to not just expect that they're going to jump in and join us here, but to meet them there and say, this is your space. It isn't always easy for me as a Jesus follower to be here, but I want to join you here. And then to start to move them through that space into a new one. To say, why don't you join us on a Sunday night? We ask questions. We don't assume that you have a foundational understanding of the Christian faith. We don't assume that you'll get the language of Sunday morning church, but we want you to join us here where it's safe, where we share this space, where the two worlds overlap. And then ultimately to say, when you're ready, when you actually want to journey in this thing that we call faith, in this thing that we call the Jesus life, then we have a space for you. In home groups, in opportunities to create relationship and journey together as Jesus followers. And that's where we want to go over the next year and into the future ahead. So listen, we've been closing off this series every night, as you probably know, with a question to talk about again around tables. But at the close of this conversation for the past 4 weeks, I really want us to pray. I want us to pray together as a community about where God might be leading us. Maybe where he might be leading you to participate and engage with us. But ultimately, where God is taking this community to be a space in which people who are on the margins of church, the margins maybe even of faith itself, can find a landing pad where they start to belong. So would you pray with me tonight as we close? Father, we're thankful. We're thankful that you call us into this journey. That wherever we're at, new, old, whether we've been walking with you a long time or we're not really sure where we're at with faith, this is a God who is faithful to us. A God that is gracious to us and patient with us, but a God that calls us in. Jesus, you call us as Christians to participate, to get out of our bubble into the world beyond these walls. And you call those out there to start to come home, to start to come back to this space where anyone can belong, because you gracefully met them right where they are. Jesus, I'm thankful for my friends here. I pray for a crystal clear sense of vision and direction for us as a community. Would you help us to know where you want us to go from here? Would you help us to know how we can engage, how we can embed ourselves in the lives and stories of those that you care about so incredibly, but often are missed by church, often that we don't think about, often that we forget about. Father, you left the 99 to find the one. Lord, we're that one. Help us to remember that is the beginning of each of our stories, and help us to live that out in the world beyond these walls. Jesus, it's in your name that we pray and we bless you. Amen and amen.